bits in history. But when I found out that in 1761 he was in the mountains of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, I really took an interest. I hiked some of the William Bartram Trail and found that this trail, the trading path, went some of that same route. We think of Marion, of course, in the swamps of South Carolina, that element. But there was this is the swamp we went to on one of the tours, George. I was down here, Halfway Swamp, I believe. Right. Yeah. So we see Marion in that element. Forgive me, I hope I don't say Morgan at any time. I work at Cowpens National Battlefield, and I'm used to saying Morgan, Daniel Morgan. So Marion was used to this element, low country element, fighting against the British. But in 1761, we're seeing him fighting for the British in a different element than he was used to. There were a lot of things going on that led to the Cherokee War, it was called. We don't know what the Cherokee called it, but among the South Carolinians, it was called the Cherokee War. In 1759, Governor Littleton started out on an expedition against the Cherokee. In 1760, there was another expedition under Montgomery. And in 1761, there was the Grant expedition, which was the largest expedition of them all. Over 2,000 members of that expedition. Some of the things that were happening, of course, there was Indian trade. There were Indian traders, going up from Charleston. Not all of them were honest. Some of them were like Beamer and some of the Adaires, but some of them were not honest. They used false measures with Cherokee. And so the Cherokee were upset about that. Also, there was encroachment on their territory by settlers as they felt into their area. And then there were forts that the British had established. There were some problems there. One of the problems was this fort here. The people of Charleston and also 96 were very much afraid. This was during the French and Indian War, and they were very much afraid of Fort Toulouse, which is in Alabama on the Coosa River. And it was only 7 days march from Fort Loudon, which was the westernmost English fort. It's in Tennessee today, about 425 miles from Charleston, but only 7 days march from Fort Loudon. And Fort Toulouse was 425 days march from Charlestown. So the people of South Carolina were very concerned to have a French fort so relatively close. There's a reenactment at that French fort, Fort Toulouse. Here's Fort Loudon, reconstruction today of it over near Van Ord, Tennessee. Again, considered part of South Carolina at the time. What had happened, the Cherokee had fought on the side of the British in some of the Indian wars in Pennsylvania. And they were coming back through Virginia, and they were attacked, some killed. So in their idea of retaliation, blood retaliation, they had to retaliate in kind. The Cherokee did. So the retaliation did not have to be in Virginia, however. It could be among any of the whites, the Anglos. So they did attack frontier settlements. There was a massacre at Fort Loudon in Tennessee. There were atrocities on each side, Cherokee and British. stop. Not the, we'll go back, we'll go forward. Then you go forward one. Led that third expedition in 1761 was James Grant, Highlander James Grant. He was a veteran of the Indian Wars in Pennsylvania. He prepared very well for this third expedition. And this is the one we know that Francis Marion was on, this third expedition against the Cherokee. The punitive expedition of 1761. The Cherokee had really come to the peace table, but there was no denying that the Carolina Morning War, Jeffrey Amherst at the time was the commander of all the British troops in North America. And he sent, Grant had been under the Montgomery expedition of 1760. He'd been second in command, but he'd been back up north. He'd been in Pennsylvania, so he prepared very well for this expedition of 1761. Now, who was on this expedition? Here is the ancestor of one, you may have seen this as I scrolled through it a little bit there. Here's the descendant, rather, not the ancestor, the descendant of one of the persons on the expedition. He was a native man from New York State, an Indian man from New York State. And this is the 20th century photograph of his descendant. You probably don't know who he is from this photograph. But you might have seen this one. Actually, it's the one on the left, not the right. Yes, Tonto was J. Silverheels. And Silverheels was along on the expedition. See, even in the French and Indian War, the British had their Indian allies. Most of the Indian allies were on the French side. But there were some from New York State, some of the Mohawks and others. The Stockbridge Indians from Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and others. Tuscarora, Catawba, who were on the British side in this. So here is one person that is descended from Silverheels, and likely Francis Marion used Silverheels. By the way, we don't know a lot about Marion on this expedition. We have to infer a lot from just what happened. We know the geography. We know that Marion would have experienced that geography. We know the people on the expedition, and he would have known a lot of people on the expedition as an officer. Here is, I thought I had a picture of some of the other people on it. Let me go back a minute. Maybe that's it. Maybe I have it somewhere later. But here is I need to stay here, don't I? And I move back. Here's a map showing the trading path starting out from Charleston. They went up through the Congarese. This was spring of 1761. They were joined by more on the way. Went through 96, and they went through the Clemson area, and they went up to Keowee, which was the principal trading town, Cherokee town in western South Carolina. And 96, of course, was 96 miles back toward Charleston as the traders went back. If they had gone on, the trading path went to Chota, which was one of the original Cherokee towns over in Tennessee. However, this expedition of Francis Marion was on did not go that far. If you can see Cowee, C-O-W-E-E, Cherokee pronounced that Cowee. They went that far and a little bit further. Actually, they went over as far as where Cherokee, North Carolina is today. Very remote back then. Of course, we have access to it today by 19 and the interstate. It's a tourist destination. Here again, you see this great map here. You see Fort Prince George. You see the middle towns and you see the out towns. That's where Francis Marion was in 1761. These Cherokee towns. So it got underway on 20th of March, 1761. consisted of 2,828 officers and men, including two independent battalions, numbering 1,400 provincials, rangers, wagoners, Indians, and African Americans. So this made up a large army, much larger than the armies before, and Francis Marion was part of this. Here's another person on I have this misplaced. Here's another person on the expedition. James Adair later wrote a book on the Cherokee Indians, one of the early books published in London, and they reprinted in the 20th century. He always, of course, said that Cherokee descended from Hebrews. Here is the list of the ones that Marion may have known. King Hagler was with of course, with the Catawba. Silver Hills that I mentioned before. James Adair. Hugh Waddell was a frontiersman from North Carolina. There's some question about whether he was along or not. We think he was. We think he recruited the Catawba Indians who were along. And of course the South Carolinians, Henry Lawrence, Andrew Williamson, and you know Andrew Williamson was to lead a expedition later during the Revolution in 1776 as part of the Rutherford expedition. And of course Pickens was there. We think Pickens was an officer. I think he was a captain. Eugene, and of course Francis Marion. Somebody this is a drawing of a famous powder horn. Somebody drew the map from the Congarese and on up. So it's a good primary source of this expedition to the backcountry. Here is another map. Showing, not quite in focus, but coming up to Kiowee, I believe in this area, and then the trail cuts west over toward Clayton, Georgia. Some of you are familiar with that area. It went by, this is in the Clemson area. It went through that area. And this is, of course, this should be back a couple of, who's on the weather vane? That's King Hagler of the Catawba. This is symbolic of him. Of course, there's no picture of him. They crossed the Seneca River there where Clemson is. This is now part of Lake Harbor. You can't see this scene today. And that's a photograph taken back in the 1950s before Lake Harbor came up that area. Of course, this whole trading path was there because of the deer trade with the Cherokee. And lots and lots, I've seen numbers of the deer skin that came down with the traders back to Charleston. And of course to Europe too. Then Fort Prince George was the westernmost fort in South Carolina. It is now underwater, unfortunately. The site is. They did some quick archaeological work, I understand, before it was inundated. But Fort Prince George and the Indian Cherokee town or settlement of Kiowee were right there where Lake Kiowee is today. This tells about it. Kiowee town. Most of the Cherokees left Kiowee by 1752, in conflict with the Creeks, but asked the British to build Fort Prince George across the river in 1753 and 54. So the fort was built ostensibly to protect the Cherokee against the Creek, but as it ended up, it was became a source of conflict between the Cherokee and the British. By the way, the French at Fort Toulouse, when Fort Loudon fell in what's today Tennessee, they had an expedition up the Little Tennessee River. They were going to take that fort for themselves. But they got in a part of the Tennessee River there where Chattanooga, Tennessee is, and they said they were floundered by the whirl and the suck of the river at that point. And they didn't make it. In fact, they established a trading post there where Chattanooga is today, and then the dissident Chickamauga Cherokee under Dragon Canoe later had made their home in that area. But we're still in South Carolina on this slide. This is Kiowee mulberry place. And they think there were some mulberry trees there. That's how the Cherokee got the name. Am I standing okay?
Yeah, if you just a little bit back, you'll get some light in your face and you won't be a black blob on the...
Which way?
Just back a little bit.
A little more?
Yeah, there you're good. There.
Great, okay. But this again was taken, the sites of these forts, Fort Prince George and the Kiowee, before the lake was ever flooded. Formed a column 2 miles long. Now that's a large army, 2 miles long. And in the end, you had some African Americans, probably on horseback. Well, they were on horseback, some of them, herding cattle. They took a lot of cattle along to feed the army. They began a forced march to the Cherokee Middle Settlements, 60 miles to the west. There was a friendly Cherokee, or they thought friendly, who told the British Indian allies that he forecast and prophesied doom for the British Army beyond Fort Prince George. Montgomery had been defeated and turned around at a place called the Narrows on the Little Tennessee River up in North Carolina. So they prophesied that would happen also to Grant's army. And Grant's men saw a carving on a tree showing a Cherokee man hauling away, dragging away one of the British soldiers. It was psychological warfare. It was meant as a warning to the British not to come further, but they did continue. This is up off of Highway 11, Cherokee Path. And this is the route they took. Crossed Highway 11, it went parallel to Highway 11 there for a ways. This is a remaining part of that path. There is a hiking trail as part of the Palmetto Trail that goes from Oconee Station Falls, up the mountain to Oconee State Park. This is the original route, part of it, that all these traders and these armies travel. Just think of the number of armies that travel this, the number of Cherokee that travel this, Silver Hills, Chief King Hagler, and others, and Francis Marion. That's part of it also. And some of the scenery along that area as you go along that trail. Then they crossed the Chattooga River at a well-known crossing, Earl's Ford. Again, many armies crossed here, many traders, many Cherokee over the years. They went up. If you look on the map, it's the perfect place for a trail. If you follow the topography. And my interest in geography is what kept my interest in this too. War Woman Creek. The trail went right beside War Woman Creek. And again, that's the same trail that William Bartram followed years later. William Bartram Trail went along the same place. Now today, if you walk the William Bartram Trail, they've got it up on the mountainside, on the side of the mountain. It cuts, but actually he followed the same path, same trading path as Marion and others. Okay, from crossing the Chattooga, they went here's the Chattooga, I believe, and War Woman Creek is here. Present-day Clayton, Georgia, which was called the Dividings because so many trails came together there. At Mountain City, they crossed what was known then as the Passover. They passed over a continental divide. All the streams this way go to the Chattooga River and other rivers, eventually to the Savannah, to the Atlantic. When they got over the Passover, Wolf Fork Creek and Kelly's Creek and Darnell Creek, all these little creeks formed the Little Tennessee River. So now from here they were going up. Some of you have been to Dillard, Georgia, and eaten there. Raven Gap, Dillard, Georgia. They're going toward Franklin, across what today is the state line, and what today is in the community of Otto on the Little Tennessee River. In this area was a place called the Narrows. And this is where Montgomery had been attacked, and this is also where the Cherokee were going to attack Grant's army in Marion. This was an area back then of cane, a lot of cane brake along there in these bottomlands. Now we think the river cane, the native cane, grows big today. You've seen some of the Chinese imported bamboo having huge, tall, big around. They say the native cane used to be more that size. Some people think it was a different variety altogether. It grew 17 to 20 feet high. When you hear of Daniel Boone, somebody hiding in a cane brake, you know, that was a good place to hide. The cane brakes were sometimes huge. And the Cherokee are not known for their horses so much, but some of these Cherokee in the Little Tennessee Valley had developed horse trading, and they had horses. And they would graze them down in these cane brake areas along the Little Tennessee River. Here is the place called the Narrows. Now you can't see it, but I photographed with the Little Tennessee would be in the foreground, and the trail went between the river and this little mountain here. That's where the mountains narrowed, and that little hill came down to closer to the Little Tennessee River. And they were going north on the Little Tennessee. Well, Marion was one of the ones chosen to go into this area. The Cherokee were shooting down. They ambushed the Grant's army here, and they were shooting down on them with bows and arrows, and with rifles also, with guns and muskets also. Now, the only one that they attacked the pack train, which was in the rear. Horses were rearing, and they were spilling flour, and but Grant was prepared. He sent some provincials back to take care of that and to save the pack train and to save the expedition. And they routed the Cherokee here on this knoll. Almost. What happened is the Cherokee had run out of ammunition. I'm not sure if it was so much a Grant victory, or they had just run out of ammunition. And toward the end, you can imagine, you'd hear the shots diminish, not as many, and probably at the end you saw more arrows coming at there. They were running out of ammunition. But they made it through this area, across a ford called Otter Ford on the Little Tennessee, and they went beyond. They got through this, and they only escaped because the Cherokee ran out of ammunition. So Cherokee defeat. There is a historical marker there nearby saying Cherokee victory. That is the 1760 victory over Montgomery. It was a political victory because Montgomery could have gone on through. He turned around, went back to South Carolina. Grant went on through. And they call it the Battle of Ecoy there at the Narrows because the nearest Cherokee settlement was the town of Ecoy. E-C-H-O-E. Sometimes you have E-T-C-H-O-E. Those Cherokee names have been anglicized and they're spelled also many different ways. But here's some kids swimming, playing. The village would have been up on that bank there, on that side, we think. You can see the great soil profile there in the bank of the Little Tennessee River. They destroyed the town of Ecoy. All the Cherokee had fled these towns. They had fled them rather than to face the British at the towns. Again, I'll come back to Marion's role there at Detroit. In all, Grant and his army, it was a Sherman-like march through the Cherokee. He destroyed 15 towns, 15 settlements of the Cherokee. Now, Marion's role there, we're not sure. Historians don't tell us a lot of Marion's role at Detroit. I want to look at my paper just a minute here to see what some have written. Of course, first of all, you have Willis Bodie. Of course, he was not first, but he was one of the first of the 19th century or 20th century historians. Grant called for volunteers to dislodge the Indians from the summit of this hill, and immediately Francis Marion and 30 of his men stepped to the front. Their ascent had to be made up of a narrow defile upon which the Indians concentrated their fire. No one who undertook it was expected to survive. Lieutenant Marion and his little force succeeded in driving the Indians from their position so that the army could advance. But 21 of that intrepid band of 31 had been killed. The leader of this fearless force had not even been wounded, although his clothing had been torn to shreds. This torn by the bullets. This is Francis Marion he's talking about. It's a little bit like George Washington at Braddock's defeat when his cloak was filled riddled with musket balls. Nearly 3,000 colonial soldiers had seen young Marion and his men moving through that laden hail, and since he had escaped injury, ever thereafter regarded him as immune to fire. They thought he was immune to bullet fire from the enemy. Where did Bodie get that? We think he got it from Weems, from Mason Lock Weems, and you can't depend on Weems always. So that's a little bit of a glorified account, quite a bit of Marion. One, William Dobbin James, who wrote an account and followed under Marion, just said that he was brave, very brave. Reported as being very brave in this. That was his account. And so you have different accounts on Marion there at Ecoit, what he did, how brave he was. The fact is, we don't know a lot, and I think some historians have romanticized it and added to it some. Okay, from here, that was an unidentified mound there, British Cherokee mound. This is where Franklin, North Carolina is today. That mound still stands. It's a mound of Nikwasi, or Nikwasi, as the Cherokee would say. Some of these mounds, very few were burial mounds for the Cherokee. They were ceremonial mounds. And they'd been built by the Mississippians or others before them. So he put up a field hospital here. He went on to Cowee. Another mound. George every now and then, for some reason, stops. There now. Some of you know John Robertson. John's map is John's map is not showing up there. Go back about 2. Anyway, Marion did, and Grant marched a forced march across Leatherman Gap, which is 4,300 feet. He went over that mountain, which there was a shorter way around, and Marion, as an officer, would have been on that part. He left some of his soldiers at Cowee and marched the rest across that mountain, and we think Marion would have been on that part. It's in the Little Tennessee River Valley, but that did the soldiers in. 1,000 were without shoes. Marched across that 4,000 foot plus mountain in a rainstorm at night. They were going on to Tennessee to where Fort Loudon was, but they never made it. They had to turn around and come back. And came along the Little Tennessee River Valley. Now, one author was William Gilmore Simms. I was not too thrilled by Simms at first, but the more I got to reading him, he's more credible than was Weems. He romanticizes, he writes in a manner that's that way, but he does have some good information about Marion in total, not just his military life, but his total life. Now, some historians have placed Marion up in McDowell County, North Carolina. He was never there. Up at Gillespie Gap, where the Overmountain men came through, they have this monument. And it says, actually, that Marion was at Ecoy Pass, and they named a road in that area Ecoy Pass. Well, the Clarksons, who established Little Switzerland, the resort area, were said to be descended from Esther. That's Frances Marion's sister. And they just named this road Ecoy Pass after the other pass down in North Carolina further south, Lincoln County. So, a lot of people have thought he was there in that area. He's not. He was never up there. This is from the Caroliniana Room. This is a copy of Weems' original document, original book, annotated by Peter O'Ree, and wherein Marion wrote a letter sympathetic with the Cherokee because those 15 towns were destroyed. They destroyed bushels and bushels of corn. It drove the mountains of the Cherokee into the mountains, and many of them starved that year, and they had to eat their horses that they had. So we think that letter being in here, not annotated, not crossed out by Peter O'Ree, who annotated Weems' work, we think that letter is accurate. Okay, the end of this, Oconee Station, came later. Of course, many of that area is underwater now. And I think you want me to mention just a minute some of the native people Marion fought with here in South Carolina. There was a company, I have found out, I'm not sure it was directly related to Marion, called the Raccoon Company, under a Mr. Austin. And it was made of Lumbee and Catawba Indians, some of the Harris family who were Catawba, fought in the Raccoon Company. Here are some of that family, some of them were known as the Redbone families. They went to Louisiana. Here is one, Reverend Joseph Willis. This man was born a slave in North Carolina. His mother, I found out, was a Lumbee Indian by the name of Sarah Jacobs. And he fought for Frances Marion when he was yet legally a slave. He went back to North Carolina after the Revolution. His white first cousin, John Willis, was in the colonial legislature, or in the legislature. He got his freedom for his first cousin, Joseph Willis. Joseph Willis went to Louisiana and established churches out there. He was the first minister, other than a Catholic minister, west of the Mississippi. And of all things, of all ironies, he held slaves himself. He had been born a slave. And by tradition, he fought for Frances Marion. We have no proof of that, but he was always proud of that fact. And here are some of the people out there where he settled.
And about 2 or 3 weeks after the symposium, we got this thick email, if I remember correctly, from somebody we never heard about horses. And didn't we want to hear about horses? We started corresponding with Jeanett Beranger from the American Breeders' Conservancy up in North Carolina, Pittsburgh. And it sounded real interesting because they're chasing the Marsh Tacky, which he's going to tell you all about. And many of you have ridden them. finds out. A lot of you have ridden them around here, hunted off of them and so forth, and there's, not many left, but they're working to save them, and they think that we can tie them directly to what Marion's guys probably rode. So, read about the bio about Jeanett in there. There'll be people out at the plantation this afternoon with probably a half a dozen horses. So, again, we'll look forward to that. And without further ado, Jeanett.
Thank you very much for having me here. As a history buff, both my husband and I, it was a bit daunting to do a presentation in front of a bunch of historians. It's kind of like, putting together a program on firecrackers for a bunch of rocket scientists. So it was a bit intimidating. But I have been able to dig up some interesting factoids about these horses through corresponding with a number of you. And I just want to say right off, if any of you know anything about Marsh Tackies or have any references to them, come see me, because I'm trying to gather all the data and compile it into our database on the breed. There are little tidbits here and there, and it's taken me about 2 years, and I've just scraped the tip of the iceberg on them. I work for the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy, and basically the Conservancy, what we do is try to conserve the old-time breeds and the genetics that they represent. After the emergence of industrial agriculture, many of the breeds that were the staple of American farmers for hundreds of years were disappearing and being replaced by, for chickens, the corn rock crosses. For turkeys would be broad-breasted white turkeys. All the dairy cattle were replaced with Holsteins. Of course, Black Angus is all over the place. And these other breeds were disappearing. Now, every time you lose a breed, you lose a tremendous amount of genetic diversity for the species as a whole. To give you some idea of the scale of things, there was a recent genetic study done on chickens, industrial chickens. They looked at all of the industrial chickens that are used today, and all of them have lost 75% of genetic diversity that was originally found in the chicken. And so, although the industrial people don't seem to be terribly moved by that, as conservationists, we're extremely alarmed by that, and so we're working to try and preserve the other genetics, because you never know if someday you're going to need those back. Perhaps these animals are resistant to a parasite or to a disease that the industrial animals aren't. The Marsh Tackies are part of this story. When we go back to the beginnings, the horses coming into the Americas, it's a very old history. Many of them came over here with the Spanish. The Marsh Tackies we do consider colonial Spanish horses, and we're trying to verify that through DNA work. But you can see that many of the horses came up through Florida and then up through Mexico. And then when you look at where the colonial Spanish breeds are today, it kind of follows that map that you had just seen. Horses coming up through Mexico, up into Oregon, and then you've got the horses that came from the Caribbean up through here, and North Carolina where the bankers are. They probably went as far north as Chincoteague, but these days the Chincoteagues are crossed with so many different breeds now that we really can't call them colonial Spanish. But the banker horses, their DNA says they're Spanish horses. Initial DNA reports that we're just starting to get in show that the Marsh Tackies are colonial Spanish horses. Florida Crackers is still colonial Spanish horses. That means these horses represent genetics from the golden age of horse breeding in Spain. These are horses that no longer exist in Spain. The horses in Spain continue to evolve, and so the horses we have here are basically a snapshot of the animals that the Spanish were using back in the 1800s. They came over with the conquistadors and the early settlers. Basically, the horses that these people brought over were anything that they could bring. They were common horses of the day. A lot of people think, oh, they were these beautiful wool horses. That really wasn't the case. If you were an early explorer, you're not going to risk your very